Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this session on governance for transboundary marine spatial planning. As if we needed reminding of the importance of transboundary issues in marine spatial planning, one of our project partners is unable to join us this morning, of the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs from Northern Ireland can't attend because they are participating in the launch of a new cross-government group chaired by DEFRA in the UK. Before I introduce the session, I'd just like to remind you that the session is being recorded. Please use the chat for general conversation, and if you have any questions that you'd like to pose to any of our speakers, then please use the Q&A function. We may not be able to answer all of your questions, but we have set up a virtual venue in the Padlet site where discussions can continue both during and after this session, and a link for that Padlet site will be put into the chat. For this session, we're going to have 3 presentations followed by a panel discussion with opportunities for you to ask questions of the speakers and other panelists who will join us later. We're going to hear speakers talking about governance arrangements in marine spatial planning, a practical example of transboundary issues from one of the SIMAtlantic case studies, and finally, we're going to get an overview of the connection between governance and transboundary issues in marine spatial planning. Our first speaker is Anne-Marie Hagen from the Maritime Centre at University College Cork, which is also where I am from. Anne-Marie is a senior research fellow in the Maritime Centre at University College Cork, and her background is in environmental science and law. She leads the National Irish Navigate project on marine governance and oceans law, and contributes to the governance work packages of many European projects on offshore energy, aquaculture development, and marine spatial planning. Perhaps unusually, although Anne-Marie is a migrant in Cork for the past 12 years, she is originally from County Donegal, just 30 kilometres from the border with Northern Ireland, where she has first-hand experience of transboundary issues, having also lived and studied in that area. And so transboundary issues are of particular interest to her. And so I'll hand over straight away to you, Anne-Marie.
Thank you, Martin. I had to explain my accent for any Cork people that are listening because I don't have a Cork accent. So I'm going to talk to you today about the governance work that we've done in SIMAtlantic. And I suppose maybe the first question for participants listening to this would be, why look at governance? You know, it's there, it's something we have to deal with, you know, just get on with it. But I think the governance context really determines the nature and the effectiveness of cooperation. So when you start thinking about transboundary issues, that cooperation is necessary, and it also, there's a need for coherence among approaches. So that was really the reason why we wanted to look at governance specifically within SIMAtlantic. And it's also one of the legal requirements within the MSP directive. So if you look at the minimum requirements for MSP, which are contained in Article 6, you'll see that member states are asked to ensure transboundary cooperation. And then Article 11 goes on to say that the maritime spatial plans have to be coherent and coordinated. And that kind of cooperation can be pursued across different or through different mechanisms. Some are long-standing, like the mechanisms set up under the Regional Seas Conventions. Others are newer and have evolved because of a specific issue or a need, so they've taken the form of a member state network or a structure. But there's also the flexibility to use other needs, and maybe that's something that has come along now because of sea basin strategies like the Atlantic Action Plan, which we heard a little bit about from Juan this morning. So in thinking about this work and how we would approach it, really what we wanted to do was look at how other legal requirements interact with marine spatial planning. So looking at instruments like the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, Water Framework Directive, older instruments like the nature conservation directives, but also the national or terrestrial planning systems. And thankfully, with the partnership that we had in the project, we had access to information from the different partners and from their countries to really see how governance was structured and how they cooperate, and how that then can lead to coherent plans. So we looked at things like the current status of MSP, because not all the countries in the Atlantic are at the same stage of implementation, how they incorporated different policy objectives into their national marine spatial plan, what structures exist for implementation of MSP, and particularly for the cross-border or transboundary cooperation aspects of MSP. And finally, how stakeholder and sectoral interests were included in that process, because we know MSP is a process and it's not just about consulting on policy documents. So in terms of just the presentation today, I'm not going to go into huge detail on how things are approached in each of the SIMAtlantic countries. That information is in the associated deliverable, which will be available on the project website in a few weeks, just when we get the final tweaks made. But what I've tried to do is concentrate maybe on the bigger messages and things that we need to think about going forward. So I think one of the key things in looking at policy interactions is to see just how MSP has been very, very closely linked with MSFD in particular. And in some ways, that's maybe an obvious relationship, because the Marine Strategy Framework Directive is expected to implement the environmental objectives of the Integrated Maritime Plan or Integrated Maritime Policy. And MSP is involved in delivering the rest of that policy. So there is an inherent link there. But what we've seen is that in some countries, in France and in Spain in particular, their governance or their governments have taken a decision to actually implement them together. And that makes the objectives, I suppose, potentially a lot more easy to achieve. What we have also seen is that the degree of interaction can be influenced by the implementation cycle. As you know, all these different directives and different policies usually have different time frames associated with them. And that can then, I suppose, affect how they can be taken account in maritime spatial planning. The language really associated with other policy objectives is quite weak and maybe could be stronger, because those other policy objectives are often derived from law, so they already have an obligation or obligatory side to them. But we're still seeing language like take account of and should, and there's not really the much stronger wording. But that might come again as implementation develops over time. Generally, in terms of the implementation authorities, we're seeing that they're really usually the same nationally for MSP and for MSFD. And the reason I draw attention to that is that at some level, if you have the same implementation authorities, that should allow cooperation to happen more naturally. You're not going beyond that. But it becomes more complicated maybe when you try to take transboundary issues into account. And it can also be complicated at the subnational level, where you're dealing with many different interest groups and other entities that have a stake in the planning process. To look at this, I suppose, from the opposite perspective, to see how other policies or legal instruments take MSP into account, that's much more difficult. And I do think a lot of that is due just to the timing. A lot of the other instruments were designed, and I suppose they have been implemented much earlier than MSP came into European law. So documents like river basin management plans, even some marine strategies under the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, they don't really refer to MSP. And that is something I think that we need to take into account going forward. And it is probably something that will come up as implementation progresses. And I think another thing that has become evident from the work that we've done so far is that it's quite easy to reflect complementary objectives in different national and even subnational plans, but it's much more difficult to deal with objectives that are not complementary. And I think that will take on, again, more significance as time goes forward when we're dealing with pressures, or we are dealing with pressures from climate change. And, you know, you might get into a situation where you have very, very precise trade-off decisions to make. And we need to look at how MSP deals with that kind of issue. And that will probably evolve as our experience goes on as well. Oops. So in terms of how these different policy or legislative objectives are translated into practice, I think on the purely environmental side, we know that marine spatial plans are subject to strategic environmental assessment if they're likely to have significant environmental effects. So that's very much at the strategic level. But what we've seen really is from the implementation of MSP to date, a lot of countries have used MSP to begin zoning or allocation of space for specific uses. So for example, in France, their vocation or use map makes it possible to decide or to allocate what activities are suited to a particular space. And interestingly, the effect of that map, maybe because it's visual, maybe not, is that it has also started much more of a public debate around public rights and private rights, and you know, who should have a say in what goes where. So it has that stakeholder engagement dimension to it too, even though that may not have been the original intention. Similarly, in Portugal, they've taken the approach where the situation plan is used as a basis for individual licenses for certain activities. And in the UK and Ireland, it's much more of a policy-based approach at the moment. In Ireland, and our plan is very new, it was launched in July, there is a presumption in favour of development, but that is combined with a very strong risk mitigation hierarchy where you avoid or mitigate risks as you are making decisions on projects going forward. And this is likely to become or to develop and evolve as we designate marine plan areas, and the legislation associated with that is currently going through our parliament. So we don't really know how that's going to work in practice yet. But generally, the policy objectives really rely on other regulatory processes to be reflected into practical means. So things like consenting and licensing, and even monitoring programs that are associated with developments. So moving on to the transboundary implementation, I think it's fair to say from what we've established in the project, most transboundary consultation occurs through formal or diplomatic channels. And that in some ways could, I suppose, result in maybe not total participation, or maybe it's not necessary. I know there's some work at the international level that would say, well, maybe transboundary consultation doesn't need to happen, or transboundary cooperation doesn't need to happen until you're dealing with a specific issue. So I think that's something to bear in mind too. I've already mentioned that there are consultation requirements under various directives and also various international conventions, but I think we need to remember that MSP is more than just that consultation process. It's really intended to be participatory. And from that perspective, all the countries within the SIMAtlantic project have participated in a variety of groups at European level, at national level, and also at the regional seas level. So in things like OSPAR and the Barcelona Convention. And they also participate jointly in certain environmental monitoring programs. So there is an element of cooperation that already exists. Interestingly, all partners have said that things like Brexit, so the transition of the UK out of the European Union, will create both challenges and opportunities for cooperation and coherence. So previously, there was a commitment from the UK that there would be coordination of marine planning across boundaries. Presumably that's still the case, but there's a little bit of uncertainty, and that can create, I suppose, challenges on the ground. In France, one of their marine spatial planning documents acknowledges that it also means you have to think about how you coordinate cross-border policies in a new way or in different ways. So I think that's a challenge for us as researchers and practitioners. And then in Ireland, there's that requirement for consultation on proposals that have transboundary impacts, and that might result in evidence and the demonstration of how such evidence has actually formulated the proposal. So it goes from the very strategic level right down to actual project level. But if we look at the implementation structures from other legal instruments, there might be some learnings relevant to MSP there. Because if we look at older instruments like the Common Fisheries Policy, which may not be the best example, but there's lots of different expert groups and advisory groups set up within those legal frameworks to allow for the cooperation aspects. And one that is particularly relevant, I think, is the Common Implementation Strategy, which was established as part of the Marine Strategy Framework Directive. There's also a Common Implementation Strategy associated with the Water Framework Directive. And if you read back on the history of these directives and the thoughts that went around at that time in terms of how they could be implemented, it was acknowledged that there were a lot of technical challenges, a lot of scientific challenges, and that the subject matter itself was challenging. So there was a definite need to cooperate. And then you had to think, you know, is there a common way we can allow that? And that's how these common implementation strategies evolved. At the moment, there isn't anything similar for the Marine Strategy or for the Maritime Spatial Planning Directive, but maybe that's something that could be thought about. I think the presentations we've heard so far this morning show just the range of complexity that is involved in MSP. Obviously, with the UK departing the EU, OSPAR arguably takes on a much stronger significance because it's one of the only regional structures for cooperation. And they don't look at marine spatial planning in itself, but OSPAR does have a lot of work areas that are relevant to MSP. So things like the ecosystem-based approach, marine protected areas, their biodiversity strategy, and their work on climate change. But I think really what we've seen from this governance work is, aside from the legal requirements, there's really no mechanism for sea basin level cooperation. And that maybe means that a lot of people are relying on more informal mechanisms, which can obviously work as well. But I think that's an interesting conversation to have. And I've put up this diagram from one of the French guidance documents because I think, and I'm not a diagram person, but I think it captures very well just the complexity involved in implementing marine spatial planning, the variety of scales that it operates, and the different levels of stakeholders and interest groups around. So it's not an easy thing to do, and maybe that's why we don't have a very set approach to how governance of transboundary issues is approached. Yep, so last slide. So in terms of the conclusions, I think from looking at the various policy documents, there have been significant efforts to achieve coherence at that policy level, but it's much more difficult to determine how that has translated into practice, and also how it has translated into practice at a transboundary level. From the literature, we know that meeting multiple policy objectives is difficult, but it's also very hard to come up with solutions, and maybe that would cause us to go back to, you know, what are we actually doing MSP for, and what do we want it to achieve? And definitely there seems to be much more focus on effectiveness rather than implementation or the mechanisms of implementation. So I think that's an important point to bear in mind. So I was just going to leave you with some questions about the transboundary aspects, and particularly the cooperation aspects, and what an absence or a lack of that what consequences that could have, and maybe a little bit to think about who oversees the cooperation. So I'll leave it at that, and hopefully we can pick up on some of these points at the end of the session when we're using it. So thanks, Martin.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie, and I'm sure there's some questions there. Just to remind you to put your questions into the Q&A box. We're now going to go to looking at some of these issues, but from a very different, sort of more practical, pragmatic angle with Adele. Adele Boyd is from the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute in Northern Ireland, part of the UK, and also part of the SIMAtlantic team. Adele joined AFBI as a senior scientific officer within the Fisheries and Aquatic Ecosystem branch in 2008, and she is the Marine Environmental Impact Project Lead within the Marine Ecology Group. Adele has over 20 years of experience in marine science and aquaculture, and is currently the AFBI project manager for the SIMAtlantic project. And as I mentioned, she's going to talk about one of the SIMAtlantic case studies. So over to you, Adele.
Thank you, Martin. Just want to check everybody can see my screen okay? Yeah.
Absolutely fine.
Thank you. So as Martin says, I'm Adele Boyd from AFBI in Northern Ireland. So just to let you know, so what is AFBI? So AFBI stands for the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute. So we are a non-departmental government body within Northern Ireland and have the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs as our sponsor branch. So this presentation is just going to give you a bit of an overview of the work that we've been doing within the SIMAtlantic project on a case study on Carlingford Lough. So we've been working with, as well as ourselves, with universities and with government departments. So within our case study, there's been AFBI, University College Cork, the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage in the Republic of Ireland, and also the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland. So this just shows you where exactly Carlingford Lough is. So Carlingford Lough is a sea loch at the mouth of the Newry or the Clanrye River on the east coast of Ireland, and it borders both the Republic of Ireland and County Louth and Northern Ireland and Counties Down and Armagh. Now the upper reaches of the loch tend to be quite shallow and are dominated by fine muddy sand and intertidal mudflats, whilst the seaward entrance to the loch is a mixture of boulders, cobble and bedrock and forms numerous small islands and reefs. So whilst the position of the land border is known, the position of where the maritime boundaries could be are much more complex, and in relation to Carlingford Lough have never been formally agreed. Because of the central geographic location of the navigational channel within the loch, it tends to be used by regulatory authorities as a de facto border whenever they're carrying out their responsibilities. So this just shows you some of the activities that have been going on within Carlingford Lough. So as you can see, this shows the designated sites. So within the areas of Northern Irish jurisdiction, we have special protection areas for birds, we have areas of special scientific interest, areas of outstanding natural beauty, we have marine conservation zones and Ramsar sites. And then on the Republic of Ireland side, we also have special area of conservation and special protection area as well, and a natural heritage area. So within then Carlingford Lough, stakeholders include, but they're not restricted to, lots of local aquaculture producers. We have fishing industry, we have boat and yacht clubs, conservation authorities, NGOs, the government departments, and then also local harbour authorities, to name just a few. And so as you can see, there's also a conflicting of interests and activities that happen within the loch. And in a move to kind of promote transboundary management within Carlingford Lough, and also our other transboundary sea loch in Lough Foyle, the Lochs Agency was set up as a cross-border body under the 1998 agreement between the government of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland and the government of Ireland. So legally, the agency would be responsible to promote the development of the loch for commercial and recreational purposes in respective kind of marine, fishery and aquaculture matters. But at the present time, as we speak, the powers to undertake some of these functions have not yet been fully transferred to the Lochs Agency. So why have we been looking at Carlingford Lough? So Carlingford Lough was selected as a case study area within the SIMAtlantic project because of its transboundary context, and it provides an excellent example of the need to operationalise ecosystem-based management. So within our case study, we've looked at marine activities, conservation objectives, kind of data integration and stakeholder involvement, with a view to trying to understand marine spatial planning approaches in the shared water body. And the case study will focus on kind of more towards aquaculture activities, because obviously we couldn't single out all the activities because there's so many of them. So while there is a substantial amount of environmental data for the loch in both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, there still exists further opportunities for integration from a management perspective. And so whilst the managing of these marine activities is very complex within the transboundary water body, and there is an opportunity for further enhancement of cross-border cooperation. So as part of the SIMAtlantic project, we're producing a non-statutory practical guidance document, which should address some of the issues I've mentioned and can hopefully provide a template for similar work in some other transboundary areas. So one of the objectives of the guidance document was provide information on activities that occur within the loch and the governing legislation and policy, and then who is responsible for all these activities within each of the jurisdictions. So we're looking at some of the things such as marine protected areas, where they're going to identify pressures and impacts and look at spatial interactions within the loch. So the next couple of slides will just show you some of the examples of what we've been producing. So the guidance document will also include a series of maps, so the reader can see the locations of all the activities and features that we're describing within the document. So we're aiming for the document to be used by government departments as well as local stakeholders, people with an interest in the area. So the map that's on the left-hand side, which shows the location of some of the licensed aquaculture sites within Carlingford Loch, and the type of species that are produced at those sites. And then on the map on the right-hand side, shows the location of kind of tourism and recreation amenities within the loch. And all these activities are described in detail within the guidance document as to where their locations and what happens at these sites. This is just some other maps. So the map on the left will show the location of kind of port and harbour facilities within Carlingford Loch. And as well as ensuring where all the activities occur in the loch, we're also looking at being able to highlight some areas of spatial overlap and potential conflicts or synergies between some activities that are happening within Carlingford Loch. So the map on the left-hand side just shows one example of this, what we're producing. So this shows the spatial overlap between licensed aquaculture sites and conservation designated features within Carlingford Loch. Now, all these activities that we're outlining within the guidance document are managed by a wide range of agencies and government bodies. In Northern Ireland alone, for example, we've got the Department of Agriculture, Environmental and Rural Affairs, we've got the Northern Ireland Environment Agency, the Food Standards Agency for Northern Ireland Water, local councils, and they all contribute to the management of and licensing and enforcement of activities in the loch. And then in the Republic of Ireland, this list is not exhaustive. We've got the Department of Agriculture, Food and the Marine, National Parks and Wildlife Service, Environmental Protection Agency, Inland Fisheries Ireland, Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, Irish Water, and the Food Standards Agency of Ireland, just to name some of the agencies. So as you can see, it's very complex systems of management and regulation within the loch. So this can be very confusing for stakeholders to try and navigate their way through. So to try and ease this process, we decided that within our guidance document, we should include a series of flowcharts to highlight the competent authorities within each jurisdiction for each of the activities that we're describing. Wanted to make it as easy as possible for users to be able to determine who they needed to speak to, or if they wanted further information on a certain activity, then they would be able to find it easily. So the example shown here is just for protected sites and conservation designations. So we've explained all this info within the guidance document, and now we're showing which agency is responsible for each of the different aspects highlighted here. So who's responsible for designations in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and who responsible for consent of operations and activities, as an example. We've also included a little box, as you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, which shows links to the relevant websites for each of the competent authorities to enable users to easily navigate to the information that they require. So this slide just shows another one of the flow charts, and this one's for marine spatial planning. So as you can see, we're trying to keep it as user-friendly as possible. So the colour scheme's kept the same throughout the series of charts. So the competent authorities for Northern Ireland will always be in a light grey box, and the competent authorities for the Republic of Ireland will always be in a darker grey box. So the aim of this section of our guidance document was to make the relevant information easily accessible for stakeholders and other government departments. So these are all still in draft format, so I apologise for any typos or slight errors. So to accompany the guidance document, we decided we'd produce a short fact sheet for local stakeholders, which will summarise the marine activities and conservation designations within the areas of Carlingford Lough. Because sometimes having a big chunky guidance document is not necessarily what people want to see and want to read. So we had the fact sheet, which will summarise everything, will accompany it, so you can have a quick go-to document that you can look at to get some also useful information. So this is also currently on the SIMAtlantic website, and we're in the process of getting printed out for distribution to local stakeholders who might not know to come across this on the website. So the next few slides are just going to briefly summarise some of the information that we're going to show within this fact sheet. So we start off with just a bit of background about Carlingford Lough and some information. Like I said, we're summarising all the main activities and the text that is within the guidance document as well, pointing out the main kind of points of reference and interesting points. So we're starting off by talking about some of the conservation designations within the area and a map showing where they're located. And then we go into the aquaculture activities, the types of aquaculture, the types of species that are cultured, and it's kind of information that people will find useful. And then this is finally some of the further pages which highlight some information as well. We're looking at water quality as well, and tourism and recreation activities. And this all can work together with the guidance document and the flow charts I've shown. So if somebody has an issue with water quality or wants to know where to report a pollution event, they'll easily be able to navigate as to who's in charge of that from whatever government departments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adele. That's, I think, a really interesting example of transboundary planning and in practice, and really sort of good juxtaposed the presentation to the first that we heard from Anne-Marie. For our third presentation this morning, we're going to hear from Steve Fletcher from Portsmouth University in England. Steve is Professor of Ocean Policy and Economy at the University of Portsmouth, and also he's the Ocean Lead of the UN International Resource Panel. He has recently advised the UN Environmental Programme and the World Bank on options for transitions to a sustainable blue economy, and is principal investigator of a recently awarded grant under the Sustainable Management of Marine Resources Programme, which is aiming to identify how a more diverse range of values can be incorporated into the management of marine resources in the UK. And without putting Steve under any pressure, I'm suspecting that this is going to form a nice link across the two previous presentations. So I'll hand over to you, Steve.
Thanks, Martin, and I hope you can see my presentation okay. Thank you to you and Anne-Marie for the invitation to present at this meeting. I haven't been involved in the project, of course, so it's great to see and hear about all of the work that's been done under the terms of this project. So congratulations on all of that. My job here today is to talk about transboundary issues in maritime spatial planning specifically. My presentation isn't quite as detailed as the previous two that you've seen, but what I have done is try to illustrate some of the attractiveness of Portsmouth by including some really quite nice pictures of Portsmouth. I think it's nice to see some other places after we've been constrained at home for so long. What I wanted to start off by saying really is to really just to encourage everybody to think about the context in which transboundary MSP is taking place. The UN Ambassador for the Oceans, Peter Thompson, always talks about the ocean crisis. He talks about that crisis being composed of three related issues: a biodiversity crisis, a climate crisis, and a pollution crisis, of which plastics, of course, play a role. And all of those crises are interrelated, but they're fundamentally transboundary. They don't respect national or any other type of boundary, of course. So there is a real emphasis, in my view at least, on making transboundary MSP work, because it is one of the primary vehicles that we have at our disposal as society to tackle the ocean crisis in a joined up, thoughtful, coherent way. So I would encourage us not to think of this as an interesting practice-based challenge or an academic puzzle. I would see this as an absolute existential question with respect to how we manage the ocean for the survival of the planet, without wishing to sound over dramatic. But I would see transboundary MSP as one of the central challenges to how we understand the ocean and how we understand our role in managing ocean resources in order to support this transition to a sustainable future. So an obvious first question, of course, is what is transboundary MSP? And I note from the previous two presentations that it has been considered as international transboundary MSP. I just wanted to raise the notion that, of course, transboundary is anything that crosses jurisdictions, in a sense, both administrative jurisdictions, legal jurisdictions, but in a sense, natural jurisdictions as well, if that's even a thing. So, of course, we are talking about MSP that strides across different countries. Different countries also may mark the borders between different regions, different political blocs, with different political ideologies and values, different economic agendas, different social agendas, different development status, different ambitions for its people, for their people. But we also have internal jurisdictional changes and boundaries. And we have jurisdictions at different scales within countries. I mean, in England, of course, we have counties, and we have districts, we have city councils, then we have some national scales in England, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland, and so on, Republic of Ireland too. Jurisdictional change is absolutely everywhere. And so, again, it's important to think of jurisdiction and transboundary as something that is almost everyday business of marine spatial planning, not something that just occurs at that international space. Now, as I was putting this presentation together, I was merrily thinking, well, that's transboundary MSP. Now, well, hang on, what actually is MSP in this context? And a couple of comments from Anne-Marie in particular have alluded to this. So I just wanted to explore this a little bit. And the classic question around MSP is whether it is a process or an outcome. Is it an empty process, of an empty vessel, or what's sometimes called the uncarved block? It's just something we can apply to solve any problem. Or is it something that, because of its structure or how it's performed, it has some kind of baked in philosophical view or perspective? I mean, if we apply MSP to a situation, does it automatically guarantee a sustainable outcome? Probably not. So actually, it can't be a philosophical approach that always delivers a sustainable outcome. It is more of perhaps an empty vessel, if I could put it like that. But we do know it can achieve multiple outcomes. We do know it can support sectoral, spatial trade-offs, if we do it vaguely all right. But it can also deliver specific ambitions. Different marine spatial plans in different parts of the world have very specific ambitions. Therefore, we know it can deliver those. But what about the global crisis? What about the ocean crisis I mentioned? Is MSP enough to deliver those? So as Martin introduced at the beginning, I've been working recently with the UN Environment Programme's Marine Branch to think about how we can support countries to transition to a sustainable blue economy. So what are the nudges? What are the institutional frameworks? What's the legal framework? What are the ambitions that we can help countries deliver through that transition? And we've started thinking about this idea of, it sounds weird, I'm sorry in advance, MSP plus, which is kind of using this notion of integrated spatial management over variable timescales that brings together transboundary considerations to deliver more than conventional MSP might consider. So maybe looking a bit more about how we tackle the climate crisis through ocean governance or through better ocean governance, using MSP as one of the vehicles for that. But then that kind of got us thinking, well, actually, if there is this ocean crisis, what we need is not tweaking the way in which we govern in the transboundary sense. It's actually some form of transformative change. We need a governance structure that enables countries or groups of countries to transform the way they manage their marine resources, and thereby regional marine resources, thereby global marine resources, in such a way that helps us deliver this global sustainable outcome. So again, rather peculiarly, we kind of think about this as MSP++, where it's even more. It's thinking about what transformative change can we support through marine spatial planning, or a different form of marine spatial planning. So what could be included in that? You're thinking, well, it might be things like, well, how do we ensure distributive justice from an MSP process? How do we support communities that are suffering from ill health or pollution? How do we enhance educational delivery and standards in areas through marine spatial planning? How do we catalyze meaningful climate action? How do we tackle poverty alleviation? What about benefit sharing? So MSP is this, if we see it as this process that we can apply, then we can be more or less ambitious about how we apply that process in a transboundary way. And again, when you sort of zoom out and look almost at the global scale, there are not many other games in town with respect to how we can manage in a spatially coherent, integrated way to achieve the sorts of global targets we need to achieve with respect to solving the ocean crisis, or at least beginning to make some dent in the ocean crisis. So that's by way of perhaps quite a strong introduction to kind of frame transboundary marine spatial planning with a greater degree of urgency, with this central role in tackling global issues that perhaps isn't always the way that marine spatial planning is considered. What I want to share with you very briefly is some findings from a report I was involved in a few years ago now. It was when the MSP directive was in early stages of implementation. The European Union, or European Commission actually commissioned a report from myself and a few others to look at how examples of transboundary MSP in other countries were undertaken, with a view to helping European countries learn about what they could do in Europe to support transboundary MSP in Europe. I haven't got time to go into the detail, but essentially we looked at 4 case studies. It's the 4 case studies that are listed there, none of them in Europe, of course. And we evaluated those 4 case studies by describing their characteristics, the governance structures, the politics, the cultural aspects, and also then interviewing a load of people who are involved in those processes to understand what worked and what didn't with respect to those transboundary examples. So I'll cut to the chase. The key finding from that study was, and I quote, "Overall, the practice of MSP is as much, often more, a social and political process with major economic consequences as it is a scientific and technical challenge." For some people that will be entirely obvious and entirely unsurprising. However, still I see most of the academic literature, a lot of the practitioner literature around marine spatial planning is still focusing upon it as a scientific and technical challenge. The statement on the screen there implies many things very quickly. It implies that we need a different set of skills, knowledges, frameworks to use that knowledge. We need institutions that can take that knowledge on board and use it meaningfully within an MSP process. And we need to then think, well, how does that relate to our next door country or the region in which we operate? Are all countries equally able to use a broader range of values within their MSP processes? So again, it makes, in a way, the problem more difficult. What I would like to do to finish off is just share with you a more detailed analysis of what the success factors were that we found across those 4 case studies. First one, a sense of collective identity, some coherence in how people doing MSP working in different jurisdictions perceive the problem. I mean, that could be next door counties, next door districts, or it could be how a county related to a district, perhaps at different spatial scales, or it could be how countries next door or regions perceived the problem they were trying to solve, or the ambitions they had around MSP. Second was a deep understanding of the existing governance system. It's really important to understand the strengths and weaknesses of the existing system in order to be able to shape the human behavior and interests that different stakeholders hold. Not to shape them, sorry, to incorporate them meaningfully in an integrative process. Trust and sense of common purpose. I've alluded to common purpose already, but trust is incredibly important. If you're going to develop transboundary MSP, you need to trust the people you're working with. And how do you generate that? How in the governance framework, particularly as I think Anne-Marie said, there was very little engagement outside of the national delegations to build that trust across boundaries. And that's really difficult. We also found that an issue-driven approach to MSP was helpful. By issue-driven, I mean the purpose of the MSP process itself. What we found, particularly from the United States example, was that because the plan had a very clear purpose, which in that case was to support the expansion of the wind, offshore wind industry, everybody knew what the game was. Everybody knew what they were trying to do. And so it was a very clear and, well, for them, easy to get behind process. Other success factors, perhaps some of these are more obvious than others, but stakeholder expectations are realistic. Not just managed, but realistic. They understand the level of their involvement, the influence they can wield, but also the constraints that were placed by the existing governance system. That's really important. Monitoring and evaluation that analyzes performance and encourages learning. Getting MSP right first time is pretty tricky. So having a monitoring and evaluation system that explicitly is learning orientated, not blame, not the failure agenda, but really focusing on how we can support positive iterations in the MSP process. Mutually recognized values. It's impossible always to have exactly the same values as our neighbors at any scale, next door neighbors, here. It's impossible, but we have to recognize and respect and find ways to incorporate those diverse values, or a more diverse set of values, into how we make decisions about the distribution of marine resources. I'll finish my presentation there, but I'll just make one final comment, which is if we're thinking about transboundary marine spatial planning, I would just really encourage us to think about what I was saying before about this notion of urgency and this notion of an ocean crisis, and a notion that marine spatial planning is one of the only games in town that can really deliver the transformative change that we need to see in order to have an ocean that provides even the most basic resources to keep the world going over the next decades. And that urgency I often fail to see in the debate and the challenge that's presented to MSP processes, practitioners, researchers, and so on, of which I include myself. Thank you, Martin. I shall leave it there.
Thank you, Steve. That was a really interesting and I suppose quite provocative talk, and a really good way, I think, of ending this the presentation part of this session and moving into the panel session. For the panel session, we're going to welcome back our three speakers, Anne-Marie, Adele, and Steve. And I'm also really delighted to welcome onto the panel Conor McCabe, who's now joined us. Conor is from the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage in Ireland, and he was late to the session for for a really good excuse in the sense that he's currently in the process of working with the government of Ireland directly in their implementation of marine spatial planning. Conor is the principal officer in the Department of Housing, Local Government and Heritage, and he is responsible for the development and implementation of Ireland's new marine planning system. The new planning system in Ireland is being done through two work programmes. Firstly, there's the National Marine Planning Framework, which was established by the Irish government in June, and a maritime area planning bill, which is actually being introduced to the Dáil, the Irish Parliament, this afternoon. So I think much of what we've been talking about in this session, in Ireland, we are trying to put that into practice, and I think it'd be really interesting to hear some of Conor's views on that. And maybe actually, Conor, if it's okay with you to open this panel session, we've heard from all the speakers that transboundary aspects of marine spatial planning require cooperation between all actors, whether they're from the public sector, the private sector, or from wider society who might have an interest in marine space. Given that you've been integral to the development of marine spatial planning in Ireland, and from your experience, what would you say is working well in terms of implementing marine spatial planning in Ireland, particularly from a transboundary approach? And how would you see the role of public authorities and other actors in their relationship to each other for ensuring cooperative and coherent approaches in implementing marine spatial planning across borders? And I'm sorry if that's putting you me onto the spot.
A nice, easy question to begin with there, Martin. Thank you. Look, first of all, can I just thank the other speakers and Adele and Marie and Steve for their presentations, and Marie and Martin for their invitation to take part. I particularly enjoyed your one, Steve. You should be working for the tourist board in Portsmouth as well. Some really good photographs there, and I'll definitely put it on my to-do list or to visit list. It looks great. And some aspects of it, funny enough, you're kind of speaking, you know, you're speaking much better language, but you're speaking the same kind of sentiments that I feel about not the potential for marine spatial planning. I'm sorry if I digress for a second, Martin, with your question, but I just want to bring up a couple of points there on points you raised, Steve, because they're very in line with the way we're thinking here, I think. So I suppose one aspect, one potential pitfall I see for marine spatial planning is that it becomes just a strategy, and it's something that kind of the outcome itself is a marine spatial plan. And that's something I'm very fearful of. I think it's and I think this is what you're kind of saying as well, that for me and for us, and I have a couple of members of the team on board online here, Tom and a couple of others who will, I think, agree with what I'm saying. It's really the start of the beginning. And what we're looking to do here now is create a new governance group called, the full name is Project Ireland Marine 2040. Shortened to Marine 2040, because we see it's really important to have a spatial plan and a development plan working in unison. And the spatial plan obviously sets out a long-term agenda of what happens where and how those things are going to interact. But the nuts and bolts of bringing things to the surface is really captured in that development plan, or as I like to call it, the activation plan. And I'm really looking forward to getting stuck into that one in the next few months. I think we should talk more, Steve. Is what I'm saying, but it makes sense what you're coming to. Just to go back to your question, Martin, and please correct me if I miss a couple of parts on it. But I think we've had a very strange few years in terms of transboundary cooperation. And like there's an obvious elephant in the room here, that when I began in marine spatial planning, it was very easy to meet my immediate transboundary partners at various European meetings and all that. And that has changed, and we're dealing with that, the backwash of that now. But what I would say is that at official level, we've very strong and excellent relationships with the various organisations in Northern Ireland, Scotland, England, Wales, and the Isle of Man. And I think that gives a good platform and potential for future collaboration. I think I'm getting a sense from a lot of people that even though the last couple of years has been very much driven by the politics of the situation and the outcome of various things, it's now maybe time for us to kind of put our heads together and start working more seriously and at official level, dare I say, at moving things forward in terms of proper collaboration across boundaries. I'm not saying there hasn't been any, but we've a great opportunity now, and I'm very interested in pursuing the avenue of the British and Irish Council to give a very practical example as a means to tackle some of these opportunities. And I'm avoiding the word issues because I think there's real opportunities in working together, both from an economic perspective, but also from that climate change and ocean health perspective that's been mentioned. So I'm not sure if that answers your question fully, Martin, but it's certainly just some thoughts to maybe get us started.
Well, I think thank you, Conor. I think that's a really interesting response, and I think before we go to some of the questions that immediately can spring to my mind, we have some questions from the participants in this session, and perhaps just to sort of take what you were saying, Conor, back down to sort of grassroots. Adele, we have a question here about whether the case study and the development of the guidance document, to what extent has that stayed within the sort of the policy domain, and to what extent has it involved other stakeholders in the process of building up that approach of conversation, dialogue and guidance for marine spatial planning?
Yeah, it's a good question, but unfortunately, we started discussions and meetings in Dublin about this at the end of 2019, and started putting plans in action at the start of 2020, and then COVID hit us. So the scope and opportunities for more stakeholder involvement was very limited. So it was limited to in the first instance to the project partners. So it was the government department and then our research institutes and the university, obviously. Although within AFB we have other projects that are the maritime project that's working with developing with management plans within Northern Ireland and Ireland, and Carlingford was one of their areas. So the SIMAtlantic team within AFB have been coordinating and chatting to the maritime team, and because they were able to organise some stakeholder engagement events before COVID to try and get some of their input, and we will be sharing. I think they're having another steering committee meeting in the next couple of months, so we'll be presenting the guidance document and some of the fact sheet to them then, because some of the things that come out of the flow charts and the different legislation was also ideas that came from MARP and what their stakeholders were saying they needed. So whilst we haven't been able to have our own meetings, we have been chatting to other projects within similar areas that have been able to do that before COVID hit.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think it's really interesting how all of the speakers have really been addressing, if you like, the challenges of marine spatial planning, not from the issues or as a problem, but really from the opportunities. This leads on to another question from Stephen J, which is around, for marine spatial planning to address the ocean crisis, it would have to expand beyond into areas areas beyond national jurisdiction. And although we know there's a lot of effort around developing governance processes for the high seas at the moment, it's probably fair to say that there still is not adequate governance structures. And Stephen's just wondering if the Antarctic and the Coral Sea case studies, Stephen, that you used in your work, whether they have any experiences to offer here.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. And thanks, Stephen, for the question. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, certainly the CEMLAR, the Antarctic case study, does include areas beyond national jurisdiction within its remit. So there are certainly some examples or some insight to follow up on there. I don't have that insight at my fingertips, unfortunately, so I can't share that. But I have put the link to the document in the report, sorry, in the chat box. And within that document, there are very detailed breakdowns of the results for each of the 4 case study areas, and so it's very straightforward to pull out that analysis. But what I would say is that the vast majority of the activities that are impacting on the ocean, that one might argue are generating the ocean crisis, are not in areas beyond national jurisdiction. They're within the exclusive economic zone of countries, of which countries already have adequate power to control those activities. So in a sense, I think waiting for governance arrangements, which of course are in development. I mean, the process to develop a treaty for the high seas is drawing to its conclusion. That is a result of that will be generated within the next sort of 18 months to 2 years, as I understand it. So that isn't that far away. But I do wonder if that's a bit of a false reason not to really engage with that agenda, because I think we have the governance arrangements already where the problems are sourced. So I would say that isn't really such a critical issue for the ocean crisis.
Okay, thank you. Anne-Marie, would you like to comment on that? Because I know you have done some work around ABNJ.
Yeah, it's an area that has been, I suppose, the focus of a lot of discussion within the BBNJ treaty discussions, and I think everybody has acknowledged the difficulties involved, but again, nobody has come up with a good solution as yet. So it is something that will evolve, and I think really because the high seas areas are so expansive and cover such a range of contexts, it's very hard to come up with one regime that's going to be applicable everywhere. So I think that almost puts it back into what Steve was saying. It has to be a cooperative effort, and it has to be national jurisdictions that take a lead on it. And maybe this is something Conor could comment on, but in Ireland we have extensive areas of extended continental shelf, and I just wonder, would that be a driver for maybe more transboundary cooperation with, say, France and Spain? Because I know when you talked about who you were talking to, it was mostly UK. So maybe this is an opportunity as well as an issue for that.
Absolutely, yeah, and I think that's in the very near future. We'll be looking at those. I definitely think there's a bit of clearing up to do on the governance arrangements. I accept the point that there is governance. There isn't nothing there. It's not a blank sheet of paper. But certainly, and I only want to comment, I suppose, on our own jurisdiction here, at the risk of offending anybody in other jurisdictions. But certainly, we feel that we need to clear up some issues that are outstanding in terms of who is responsible for what, the nitty-gritty, and is there an overall body. And the piece of legislation that Martin mentioned earlier on that we're introducing to the Dáil, the Irish Parliament this afternoon, does just that. It introduces a new agency called the Maritime Area Regulatory Authority, or MARA, and it will be at the forefront of governance arrangements throughout the entire maritime area. Ireland's maritime area is is extensive, 7 times the size for land, but there's a multitude of operators, a multitude of regulators operating in a very linear fashion. So we're bringing in one agency who's one of many purposes that agency will be as a coordinating body, sitting across all of those various sectors. So I think I think in some ways we need to sort out the governance arrangements in our jurisdiction first, and then move on to discussing potential opportunities with the continental shelf partners we have.
Okay, thanks. I think this also leads into another question that we've got from Donald Griffin, who's asking, to what extent does political will or lack of will or agendas inhibit marine spatial planning in transboundary areas in comparison to normal MSP? I'm not exactly sure what normal MSP means in that sense, but is there an extra challenge for transboundary MSP? And over and above, I suppose what he's meaning by that is it's perhaps, as you were saying, Colin, there is no policy vacuum for the marine space at a national level. So perhaps to a certain extent, it allows a planning process to be put in place using that existing policy framework. But is there the policy frameworks that allow for transboundary planning in the context of marine spatial planning? And I suppose that could come down to do things like the Atlantic Action Plan, or indeed some of the European directives provide an adequate framework for that sort of cooperation and coherency between national areas for marine spatial planning. Another awkward question, I appreciate.
I suppose I'm going to try to be practical here. I think the question is really interesting from Donal, in that, look, I suppose from our point of view, or from my point of view, certainly there was great political momentum behind the Marine Spatial Plan, or certainly the politicians who were interested in it were very enthusiastic about it. Like some wanted to see us go a bit further and some wanted to see us go a little bit less, but regardless of where their positioning was, they were enthusiastic about the idea of a spatial plan, and that's really good. And we had a very solid governmental structure to bring it through, and that was most welcome and facilitated the introduction of our Marine Spatial Plan. There are certainly other jurisdictions who might not have that sense of solidity, and I think if that's what your kind of question is about, Donal, then yeah, I couldn't agree more. You need that kind of backing, that's for sure, in order to kind of proceed, particularly if marine spatial plans are statutory plans, ones that need to be signed off in various parliaments. So I suppose that's a direct answer to that. So how do we tackle cross-border, I suppose, marine spatial planning? And this is something that I'd really like to look at next year. I think the subnational planning in Ireland is really where we're going to kind of be looking at that and building on the really great work that's been done by SIMAtlantic around Carlingford and Foyle. Like my ambition would be that if we could fast forward into the not so distant future, we might be able to establish something along the lines of coastal partnerships around those areas to work together on localized marine spatial plans, and to have a really collaborative approach into how we can utilize those areas. And they could be would you say melting pots for future cross-border or cross transboundary plans to be made. But we live in a global a world, a planet now. The marine doesn't know, it's a well-used cliche, but the marine doesn't know these boundaries. So we need to be working with people who are on the opposite side to these invisible lines.
Okay, thanks. That answer leads really nicely into another question that we've got that's been given to us by Juan Ronco from the European Commission. He's directed at Anne-Marie, but I'd actually like Steve, maybe once Anne-Marie's answered, maybe to get your opinion on this as well, which is if you were to advise the European Commission on a review of the MSP directive, if coherence at sea basin level was to be reinforced, what criteria standards would you propose? And it's perhaps worth just reminding ourselves that within the SIMAtlantic project, we've been looking at the OECD's framework for coherency around sustainable development in a more general sense within the project. But he's also asking, would you also propose to set up a sea basin coordinating body, as well as what sort of criteria standards would you be looking for? So maybe Anne-Marie first, and then maybe Steve, you might have something to say about that.
Thanks, Martin, and thanks, Juan, for the question. It's a difficult one. I haven't thought about criteria, to be honest, but I think one of the things that seems to come up again and again is, there's an idea that we're embedded in the legal side of this, and obviously as a sort of quasi-lawyer, that's fine, but the governance side of it is much more than just what we have to do by law, and I think that relates very much to what Steve said in his presentation. So we really need to look at how different sectors and the public engage with this process as well. And I think that is going to be very important for coherence, because really it's the people and the sectors that will be implementing this in practice. Obviously, you need the governance structures there too, but you know, the way they operate mightn't be coherent across boundaries or across places. So I think, you know, in terms of a, I'm not sure what your phrase was, but a sea basin coordination group, yes, that would be one element, but you know, there's much more to it than just that official level. It has to reflect the involvement of all the actors. And I think that's much more difficult. It's difficult to do at national and subnational level. So to do it in a transboundary context is difficult. And the other thing maybe that links to that is generally how we monitor and evaluate the success of MSP, because I think that process should inform the Commission and how they move MSP forward, because yes, we have a directive, but it is an adaptive process, so maybe it will change over time. And I think it would be useful to think about those aspects too. So maybe not a direct answer, but some further thoughts.
Martin, my view on this, I'm glad that Anne-Marie went first, because that's a very difficult question. If I could maybe just pick up an answer to Donald's question at the same time, Martin, if that's okay with you. I mean, I think both questions have a certain degree of synergy between them, actually. Donald's question around political will and so on, and then this idea of sea basin kind of coordination groups and, you know, what would make those effective. The answer to both questions is it depends. You know, it depends, you know, what you're trying to achieve, what the policy coherence is between the different regions, what the cultural differences might be, what the economic status are. It's almost impossible to answer that question with any definitive statement, because it depends on so many different variables. But what I would say with respect to the political will and the coordination there, on one level, if we're talking about transboundary between countries, MSP, then at one level, it's about international diplomacy. It's senior politicians considering how countries relate to each other. At a local level, it might be practitioners or community groups having good relations with people on the other side of the boundary, on the other side of the estuary, or whatever it happens to be. So there's a huge spectrum of what would make that kind of transboundary arrangement work. With respect to the question around sea basin coordination, I would say it's a function of what you're trying to achieve through that process. And I think we're potentially risking seeing MSP as the end rather than the means to whatever the end is, if that makes sense. If the end is a sustainable ocean that supports human communities and the economy whilst protecting the critical natural capital that we need to keep the entire show on the road, then actually sea basins may or may not be the right scale. It depends on what it is, what the issues are in that particular place. So I would say, in a way, assuming sea basins are the right scale is a little bit of a tricky statement to make from the outset, if that makes sense. Sorry, I don't feel I'm explaining that terribly well. Just one final point, Martin, if I may, just quickly. Conor mentioned something in an answer a few minutes ago now around getting the national system figured out first and then thinking a bit more about the transboundary issues. I think that's what you said. Forgive me if that's a slight blurring of what you actually said. One of the things that came from our work for the European Union was to basically to recognise that countries try and figure out their own system first, but to encourage countries or regions or whatever to put connectors into their national system. So whatever the national system is, there is a connection point into the neighbouring country or the neighbouring group of countries or the other countries that are around the same basin. And it could even just be something like a ocean basin partnership or a river basin partnership or something like that, or it could be some kind of science coordination body or something. But as long as there's something that allows a connection to be made with the other MSP processes that share that same ocean space. Sorry. Thanks, Martin.
Okay, thanks. If I can just pick up on this issue of sort of scale and sort of shared outcomes, and thinking about MSP as a means rather than an end, where I think then it's around understanding shared objectives and shared almost visions at different scales as to what people want now and in the future. Maybe we can bring it back down to a more local scale and ask Adele, do you feel that sort of across that border, which is a national transboundary border, but which one that operates at a very localized scale, whether there is a shared sort of vision and objectives either side of the border, which allows for those, as Stephen has suggested, those sort of connectors between different planning processes that may be slightly different either side of the border, but where there may be those sort of shared means and outcomes and objectives is what people are seeking to do.
It is very tricky, but I think there is the shared will to work together. But at the moment, it's hard bringing in all the different factors and all the different stakeholders and all the interested parties. I mean, I know there are departmental working groups between the two government departments that work together on certain issues. But it's knowing, because there's so many different licensing authorities in both jurisdictions, there's still the scope to get them all together to work on all aspects. I know, I mean, there's a working group that looks at the bottom grown mussel industry consortium forum, which is a north-south industry, and they have meetings, and it's from there's representatives from both jurisdictions of the government, from the local producers, from everybody to work together to share the resource and share survey results and ideas and that kind of thing. So there is those types of groups operating, but I think there is an overarching group kind of controlling everything and every aspect of marine spatial planning that I know of. I could be wrong in terms of the government. So there is still scope to do that. But again, it's a very, very tricky to organise everybody and getting them all together. But there is a will to do it, and there's a lot of coordination and working together within all the different departments and research institutes.
Okay, thank you. And just as sort of a last point, which is made by Frederic Herpes, who I know is part of the MSP, EU MSP platform. And he just makes the point that the Atlantic Action Plan already has a steering committee, and whether an action, something like, if you like, a policy instrument of the nature and at the level of something like the Atlantic Action Plan, with the sort of the governance structures that it has, whether that could play a role in transboundary cooperation and coordination for MSP. I don't know if Holly, you want to have a go at that one, or perhaps Anne-Marie.
I don't mind. I suppose I can say that we will have a representative from the Atlantic Steering Committee in the closing session this afternoon, so maybe it's something that she can pick up on in her talk. Yeah, it's interesting, because I think there's possibly a little bit of confusion about the function of the Atlantic strategy, and for some people it's very much focused on development, and you know, maybe that's one element of MSP, but it's not the whole focus usually. So I think that adds a complicated dimension, because you know, how do you balance the environmental side or even sustainability more generally within that? And it does cover quite a range of topics too, not all of which are addressed through MSP. So it's possibly more focused on the Atlantic, well, what am I trying to say? Like all different aspects in the Atlantic and not just the marine ones. I'm not making much sense. Sorry, Martin.
No, I think that is a difficult one. I think one of the, I think all of you have mentioned that that the challenges around MSP are not don't originate from a lack of policy, and maybe one could argue that there's too much policy operating at a variety of scales that don't, and none of them have really been cognizant of each other in the way that they've been designed and implemented. I'll hand straight over to Steve. I see he's had his hand up. I'm sure
Yeah, thanks, Martin. I should just say at this point, I have no real familiarity with the Atlantic Action Plan, so forgive this comment if it's horribly naive. But what I would say is that the way the question was framed and the way we started talking about it is about coordinating MSP. And again, if you think of MSP as the process, not the outcome, well, we're not really coordinating MSP. We're coordinating an ambition that we have for the Atlantic. And the ambition that we have, just for argument's sake, let's say is a sustainable ocean, sustainable Atlantic Ocean that supports human communities, protects critical natural capital, that sort of thing. And it does it in a broadly equitable way from a social and economic perspective. That would be a good outcome for the Atlantic that's very much aligned with Sustainable Development Goals. It's aligned with the Sustainable Blue Economy type agenda, all that sort of stuff. So coordinating MSP almost is then the method that delivers some of those things. It's not the end in itself. So again, I wonder if the question is really, what should the Atlantic Action Plan have the ambition to do that can be delivered through a coordinated marine spatial planning process? And I can only ask that question because I don't know enough about it to go any further than that. But I think sometimes we need to be careful how we ask the question, because the result can be quite procedural rather than actually change orientated, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good question for us to store up for this afternoon. We've got about 5 minutes left, and in a way, I'd just like to turn the boundary around a little bit. We've really been talking about transboundary in the sense of sea boundaries between countries, but I always like to think that there is another boundary here, and that's the boundary between the sea and the land, and that's another transboundary challenge with different planning processes. And as my colleague Jeremy Galt mentions, there's sort of a white gap between the land planning process and the sea planning process, and they don't really sort of dovetail or align particularly well with each other. And so I'd just like to finish the discussion by actually, just if I can pick on you, Steve, first, but then also maybe ask Connor to have the last word about the relationship between marine spatial planning and the relationship in marine spatial planning with the coast, not necessarily with coastal management, integrated coastal management as the instrument, but what are the transboundary challenges in implementing marine spatial planning in a way that is compatible with the coastal space as well?
My goodness, Martin, you've got a good line in tricky questions, I have to say. Congratulations on that. It's interesting that there is a report I published fairly recently for the International Resource Panel on almost exactly this question, really. It's about how land-based activities can influence the quality and extent of and health of coastal resources. And I'll put the link in the chat box in a moment. And the conclusion of that is that essentially there needs to be better land-sea governance, and the land component of the governance system needs to take into account more fundamentally the implications for ocean resources, of course. Land governance has the benefit of history, and having been around for a long time, it's very well developed in theory, at least. It's got a lot of connectors into its neighbouring areas. So if we talk about transboundary land to land, country to country land areas, then in theory, at least, there is a reasonable amount of connection points in place. But what there isn't then is the land to sea connection points, if that makes sense. So the equivalent connectors are not there from an ocean perspective. But they really need to be, Martin. That's the truth of it. And for whatever reason, some countries just don't recognise that land-sea interface as being a really challenging zone, and the work with the International Resource Panel, we looked at examples from Mexico and China and all sorts of other places, and that white gap that Jeremy refers to is absolutely real and pervasive around the entire planet, unfortunately.
Okay, thanks. And perhaps, Steve, I could ask you just to put that report, a link to that report into the chat window. Connor, would you have anything to say around that? I know it's a really sort of nasty question, but at some point, you know, the activities that we plan for and that are taking place in the marine space do have to come on shore. We know that creates a whole plethora of issues, and it's interesting when you talked about I can't remember the name, but some of the marine activity in Ireland has got a 2040 time horizon, and of course in Ireland we also have Project Ireland 2040, which is essentially looking at sustainable development, social and economic development on the land. Doesn't really touch too much into the marine space. So is there an idea perhaps around that there will be a degree of coordination between the sort of marine planning 2040 horizon with Project Ireland 2040?
Yeah, like honestly, you could run an entire conference on this topic alone. But just to directly answer those questions, the Marine 2040 board is a subset of Project Ireland 2040. Because it's exactly what you're saying, Martin. We wanted to make sure that there was a joined up approach into how we're planning for the terrestrial side and the marine side. So what we have now is a national planning framework, a statutory spatial plan for land, and a national marine planning framework, a statutory spatial planning framework for the sea. Both are statutory spatial plans, and they both work together as sister documents. There's no hierarchy between the two. They're both at the same level. Any plans that come under the national planning framework must take the NMPF into account, and vice versa. So any sea plans will have to take the national planning framework into account. So this is forced land-sea interaction at a basic planning level. Through the bill, that the aforementioned bill, the MAP bill, will be bringing the local authorities whose area of responsibility ended at the high water mark, will be bringing them into the sea. So their corporate plans would be extended by default, I suppose, to a 3 nautical mile limit, coastal local authorities, obviously. And that in itself is again forcing land-sea interaction to be operable into the nitty-gritty of local area planning. In terms of the investment plan, and again, if you wind me up on this one, I'll just keep going. But in terms of the investment plan, like one thing the National Planning Framework and Project Ireland did have was port development. So there was that land-sea interaction that occurred within that Project Ireland group. But we want to see that extended out. It will be extended out. It's not a want, it's going to be. It's a government decision made in June that this governance group will be formed. It will be a subset of Project Ireland, and it's to enhance, develop, activate, reawaken and awaken activities that take place in the sea area. And you're absolutely right, if you're building an offshore wind farm, it has to land on land. It has to have landfall. So one thing we're also doing in the bill is having a common consent process there. So on board Penola will consent the planning permission for the land element and the sea element, thus having an overview of both and taking into account both the national planning framework and its subnational plans, and national marine planning framework and its subsequent national marine planning, subnational marine plans, which we will be working on the next couple of years. I'm trying to fit a lot there into a minute. So.
Okay, well that's really good.
Key message, Martin, is we're on it.
Well, I think that's a really positive message as well to finish this panel session off. And I particularly like the idea that this brand new concept of forced coastal management rather than integrated coastal management. I look forward to seeing how that evolves. The last thing I need to do is to thank Steve, Anne-Marie, Adele and Connor for what I hope you have found a really interesting series of presentations and panel discussion. there is one question, Steve, that we haven't had time to address, and I will forward that to you, Steve, if that's okay. But in the meantime, we'll be taking a short break before the start of the next sessions. So once again, thank you very much to our speakers and panelists. I hope you've enjoyed the session, and I look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thank you very much.